It's pointing to the 90-degree joint angle that produces these great results in terms of hypertrophy. That is a massive finding. And again, I'm not sure why the researchers disregarded that or just didn't think it was important. If you know anything about me, you know that I've made it my life's mission and career objective to find the holy grail in terms of technique, strength, muscle growth, and range of motion. This is why I did my PhD in kinesiology at UGA. I believe I have found the answer to this question with the 90-degree eccentric isometric method, which is really just doing partials with a 90-degree joint angle. Now, there are others in this field who don't share the same sentiment.
Do stable, large range of motion movements.
If you're looking to be competitive in powerlifting and strongman in any strength sport, you must train full range of motion.
Fortunately, there's a recent study that just came out less than a few weeks ago by Larsen and his colleagues that looks at this exact topic. So let's jump into it. What they did with this is they had the participants perform leg press under one of two conditions. They either performed leg press with a partial range of motion, which was roughly 100 degrees of knee flexion, or they performed the leg press with a full or maximal range of motion, which ended up being roughly 150 degrees on average for most of the subjects. This study used a within subject design, meaning that all of the subjects were exposed to all of the conditions. In other words, the subjects trained one range of motion or one condition on one leg, and they did the other condition on the other leg. And then at the end of the study, they used ultrasound to compare the results in terms of what happened with muscle growth and hypertrophy. And again, that's what we're going to look at. And I want to see what the authors had to say, not just in the results, but also in the intro, because they look at other studies. And these studies that they mention have historically been used by many trainers and fitness influencers to suggest that large range of motion is superior to partial or 90 degrees. So let's see what they have to say. The first study the researchers reference is by Bloomquist and his colleagues. They looked at 60 degrees of knee flexion versus 120 degrees of knee flexion. And as you might imagine, they found that the 120 degrees of knee flexion produced better results in terms of hypertrophy compared to the 60 degrees. This is important to point out because a lot of people will misinterpret findings like this. They'll take a study and they'll say, look, they found that larger range of motion and training a muscle at long lengths was superior to partials. And then they'll say, see, this is why things like 90 degrees aren't as effective. But that's not what this study is saying. And a lot of these studies don't suggest that. They're taking two extremes, 120 degrees versus 60 degrees. 60 degrees or 50 degrees, that's often not going to produce enough of a stimulus to produce hypertrophy. So we have to compare things to 90 degrees, not just extreme positions in terms of a shorter range of motion. And we're going to see this in some of these additional studies. And that leads us to the next study that they reference. And this was done by McMahon and his colleagues. And this one, they looked at 50 degrees versus 90 degrees of knee flexion. And once again, 90 degrees produced greater results in hypertrophy compared to 50 degrees. But again, a lot of folks will misinterpret this and say, oh, look, longer lengths or training with the large range of motion produces greater hypertrophy than short ranges of motion or partial range. But again, that's not really what this is saying. It's pointing to the 90-degree joint angle, which oftentimes people would consider to be a partial range of motion. So it's this moderately stretched position that produces these great results in terms of hypertrophy, not these extreme stretched or ultra long length positions. This next study that the researchers reference by Kubo and his colleagues, this is kind of a seminal piece in the research. A lot of people will use this as a means of justifying larger range of motion, and some people on the other side of the fence will also use it for their argument. What they did in this study is they simply examined squats with either a 90-degree joint range of motion or 90 degrees of knee flexion versus 140 degrees of knee flexion. The results were pretty simple in this study. In terms of quadricep growth, which was the main thing they were looking at, there was no significant difference in the groups. They did find more muscle growth in the glutes or posterior chain with the group that did a larger range of motion. And I want to quickly explain why I believe that happened, because I've seen this occur quite often in real-world application. When most people squat, if they're not trained properly, they haven't been coached or cued how to do a correct squat, they're oftentimes too knee dominant. Their knees come forward excessively. They often shift their weight to their toes instead of sitting their weight back into their hips and activating their glutes. And if you do squats like that, which is often how beginners will squat, you're going to have to reach excessive depths at the bottom in order to have any semblance of stretch on the glutes or posterior chain. So it makes sense that if a person isn't squatting properly, they will in fact have to go extra deep to get those glutes to grow. This would be similar for people who do bench press. You oftentimes see people do bench press with rounded shoulders because they don't have good posture. Well, if you do a bench press like that, to get any stretch in the pectorals, you're going to have to go very deep, probably even below the level of the chest, using something like dumbbells. But if you know how to set your posture at the beginning, you know what proper technique is, and you activate your back, you're going to feel maximal stretch occurring on those targeted muscles at a moderately stretched or roughly 90-degree position. So that's the general context that the researchers for this study used. The key difference in this study is that they used leg press instead of squats or leg extensions. So we're going to go ahead and jump into the actual results of what Larsen and his colleagues found in this study. It showed that there was no significant difference in terms of muscle growth and hypertrophy for either of the conditions, whether they performed the partial range of motion versus the maximal range of motion. And if that's all you took away from this study, showing that you don't need to use excessive range of motion much past 90 or 100 degrees of knee flexion to produce ample muscle growth. If that's all you took away from this, that would be awesome. But there are some deeper implications here and some additional points of interest that I think we want to go into. Something else that I personally find pretty interesting is that the researchers in this study, they are somewhat biased towards long length positions or full range of motion because they've written articles and they've made posts on social media where they do advocate larger ranges of motion for strength training. So the fact that they actually performed a study and the results showed no significant difference between large range of motion, which they're biased to, and partial range of motion, that's pretty significant and, in my opinion, very fascinating. So how did the researchers compare the results of this study to the other studies we mentioned earlier? I'm going to read it exactly what the researchers themselves said. They said that this suggests 90 degrees of knee flexion may be more effective than 50 degrees for increasing quadricep hypertrophy. However, considering that our study and the Kubo study did not observe additional hypertrophic benefits from increasing knee flexion beyond 90 or 100 degrees, the collective results suggest a range of motion of 90 to 100 degrees may be sufficient to maximize quadricep hypertrophy. So this is pretty interesting because the researchers are taking the results from this study, comparing it to other studies, and what they're saying is that it's not necessary to go past 90 or 100 degrees of knee flexion to elicit a significant hypertrophy response in the lower body musculature. If you've watched any of my other videos on why I recommend the 90-degree eccentric isometric protocol, one of the main reasons is based on this topic in kinesiology called the length tension relationship of muscles, where we don't want the muscle fibers or sarcomeres to be too lengthened or too shortened because you don't have as much activation, you don't have as many cross bridges, meaning you won't have as much muscle growth. And the researchers of this study actually reference that exact topic. So once again, they're in agreement with me and this concept of the length tension relationship. If you go too far, you're not optimizing that length tension relationship, and there's really no additional benefit of going past 90 to 100 degrees. And in fact, a lot of the research shows it would be counterproductive. Another important side note to bring up on this study is that it's one of the first studies done comparing partials and long length in trained participants, not untrained. Because if you do look at some of the studies that suggest that going excessively beyond 90 degrees is superior for muscle growth, all of those studies look at untrained participants. And even in this study, Larsen and his colleagues point out that that might not be applicable to trained participants. And there's actually other trainers and scientists in this field who have said the same thing. Paul Carter talks about this, that basically this long length principle, it doesn't really apply to advanced trainers or people who have been strength training for a significant amount of time. And this actually leads to the last point, which in my opinion might be the most important point of this study. So I don't know why the researchers didn't mention this, if they intentionally disregarded it or unintentionally didn't want to mention it, or they just didn't think it was important. But It's the strength measures of this study when you compare the two different conditions. This to me is the most pivotal part of this study. So let's go ahead and look at that. You see something interesting. The top line represents the partial range of motion condition. The bottom line is the full range. You see a pretty big spike in strength, but there is this steady increase that goes throughout the 8 weeks. Now, you do see somewhat of the same thing for the full range of motion condition, but after you have that big spike, you see a lot more hills and valleys, especially the dips or these inflection points where the strength just all of a sudden drops. Whereas if we look at the partial range, we see that linear trajectory to the point that they're probably recovering well. With full range of motion, I can tell you from training people with full range of motion in the past, it impedes and impairs recovery substantially, and you will see these massive dips and these massive drops in strength. And for high-level athletes, if you have a drop in strength like this for a few weeks, guess what? Their performance is going down. High-level athletes can't afford that. And it would be one thing if these dips resulted in larger strength gains and hypertrophy at the end of the study, but it doesn't. It's actually less strength gained than the partial range condition. When we look at the ending strength or ending load that they had at the end of 8 weeks, when you work out the math, that means there was a 61% increase in strength for the full range of motion condition, which that's pretty solid. But if we look at the 90 degree or the 100 degree partial range of motion condition, there was an 86% increase in strength from the beginning to the end. That shows that there was a 25% greater increase in strength for the partial range of motion condition when compared to the full range of motion condition. That is a massive finding. And again, I'm not sure why the researchers disregarded that or just didn't want to mention that or didn't think it was important. But if we're talking about long-term hypertrophy, the key to that is optimizing your ability to produce force, because if you can do that, strength always precedes size. So if your strength continues to go up, you're inevitably going to see some good hypertrophy and size gains. If strength starts to plateau, I don't care how hard you're training, you're not going to gain hypertrophy, you're not going to gain size.
But wait, there's more!
One of the most common things people will say to justify larger range of motion training is that you can use substantially lighter loads to produce significant hypertrophy. Well, this study shows that you actually can't use as light of loads as you would think to produce hypertrophy, because the participants were only able to use 24% less load for the full range of motion condition versus the partial range. So full range of motion training with still 76% of the weight you would use for partial range, that's still very heavy and very taxing on the joints and something I would not recommend. Now, this study really isn't presenting anything new that we don't already know. It's simply confirming what we already know to be true in the science about range of motion training. In other words, you don't need to train with excessive range of motion to produce optimal hypertrophy. In fact, using roughly 90-degree joint angles will not only maximize your hypertrophy and long-term strength gains, but probably your joint health as well, which we're going to discuss in future videos. Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you like this video, check out this other one. I think you'll find it just as informative.